Hello and welcome. This will be a presentation on violence in the media by Kendra and Robin Dolan. First of all, let's look at a news article from The Guardian, which is an online news source and a rather global one. This article is about the protests that are occurring within the Ukraine. The article states that the violence has erupted again in the capital, with the protesters breaking through a police cordon outside of Parliament. These protesters want to limit the president's powers. As you can see, this article is fairly recent, as it is from February 18th, 2014. However, the main portion of this article was photos, which we will show you now. In this first photo, we can see the fireworks being shot off as well as the flames within the square. This violence is between the protesters and the riot police. In this next photo, we can see the anti-government protesters throwing objects into the fire, potentially at the riot police. Here, we have protesters cowering on the right-hand side, away from the flames and explosions that are occurring on the left-hand side. We can also see the state of conditions surrounding the protesters, and these conditions seem to be quite bad. In this photo, we have more riot police and protesters. In this photo, we have a protester actually running across a burning log, either going to or from the violence. In this one, we have riot police and protesters actually fighting. Here in this one, we can see smoke from exploding fireworks and fires that are rampant throughout the square. In this one, protesters are being hosed essentially, which is quite violent. Here we see protesters hurling objects. Here we see a protester preparing to hurl an object that is lit on fire. And we see the effect of that object lit on fire in this photo, as a policeman is on fire. And in this last one, we see a small boy who is walking past a burning car, showing the wreckage of the violence that has occurred. So how did you feel looking at these photos? If you were like most people, you probably felt a little sad and felt like somehow you needed to help, especially with the last photo of the little boy walking by a burning car. It's a very powerful set of images, but these are also extremely violent images, with no disclaimer warning you that you're about to view violent photos. But few of us would be offended at these photos. However, let's look at another example. This is the video game Grand Theft Auto, a highly violent and controversial video game. So, in this first photo, we see a man holding someone at gunpoint in cartoon form. In this photo, we see a guy holding a gun running away from what seems to be an explosion or fire. In this photo, we have two guys holding guns at each other with cars on fire in the background. Here we have an explosion of tanks, with police officers driving away and a helicopter crashing ahead. Here we have a gun that's been fired and some fake blood surrounding the victim. Here we have another explosion as well as shooting. This image is actually fairly violent, as it includes a chainsaw, a fair amount of blood spurting in a violent direction, as well as a decapitation. Lastly, these are children playing video games that are committing the violence that you saw earlier in these photos. These images depict violence similar in some cases, with the burning cars, people with guns, to the previous images from the Ukraine from the Guardian article. However, these images and this particular video game are highly controversial because of the source they are from. People, especially parents and conservatives, find the violence contained within these games to be inappropriate because video games are a recreational activity. However, why is it okay then to show violence that young kids can also be exposed to in a news format without any violence disclaimer? Does it depend on the way it is being presented to us? Or is it just because in our society we are ingrained to believe that certain situations are appropriate times to show violence while others are not? So what exactly is it that causes us to perceive things differently? Is it based on our own values and personality, or on what we are taught to recognize as authority? This leads to our knowledge question. To what extent does the source of information have an effect on the way violence manipulates our emotions and our perception of it? It referring to the violence. Basically, how does the source of information show violence in such a way that causes us to have some reaction to it? For example, we mentioned before how some people get quite angry over the amount of violence shown in video games. but generally have little reaction to the violence shown in the news. Maybe one of sadness or feeling like they need to help, but it usually is a limited reaction. But why is this the case? Shouldn't violence be viewed the same in all situations? Why is it okay that we have exceptions to this idea? In order to answer this question, let's look at how we, as humans, view our sources in our examples. We associate news with real life, and we see those that report it as authority figures. This is because we assume they've had extensive education and have had to research the topics they are presenting. Thus, when they show us violence, we believe they are showing it to us to educate us about what is happening in the world, not to trick us. However, how often have you watched something sad that involves extreme violence on the news and have felt pity or felt moved to action? Have you ever felt offended by the image? Probably not, unless it related specifically to you. Therefore, the news is a viable source that can show us violent images and often evoke a response from us, but usually this response is small. The response often involves emotion based on how you perceive the image. For example, you may see images of the Ukrainian violence, such as in the article we discussed earlier. From these images, you may either feel anger, sadness, or perhaps indifference based upon the way you, as a knower, perceive the world. However, you will usually not consider these images offensive, as they are showing you what is really happening and thus are a source of knowledge for you as the viewer. Looking at our other source, video games as well as movies, we don't really view that as useful, real-life applicable sources of information. Often, although movie and video game producers and creators have extensive knowledge about the topics they are attempting to portray, society often believes that they are exploiting violent situations in order to gain both fame and money. Additionally, even though movies can manipulate what emotion you feel, video games often do not. In video games, you are the one committing the violence, even though it's fake. Also, in video games, you can come back to life, setting an unrealistic expectation of the consequences that violence can have. This has become a source of controversy for some people, who perceive you being the doer or person committing the violence as a negative action that could have negative repercussions. For example, many parents are against Grand Theft Auto, as it not only allows kids to commit violence, but also to do so to authority figures. However, is it right to place blame upon a video game when it is exactly that, just a game? We will answer this question after we sum up what we have discussed so far. In general, the source of information for video games, unlike violence, conveys the idea that the violence is there just to enhance the gamer's experience. To some people, this appears a very offensive reason, as they believe it is just put there for entertainment. Therefore, violence comes across very differently in different sources. In the news, the factual manner in which violence is presented allows it not to be offensive, but rather to be put there so that people are culturally and globally aware. However, video games again do not necessarily need the violence which they include. However, it is there for capitalistic reasons because violence sells. So people, parents especially as mentioned before, get offended at this and therefore view this violence as a negative factor, something that could influence their child or loved one and basically is a corruptive force. So now back to the idea that a game is indeed just a game. Let's counter with the idea that violence always has the same impact on people. Perception is very subjective, so for some people, violence could be viewed the same way no matter what. For example, people who grow up in a more conservative household could view violence in the news and in video games with the same offensive, appalled feeling. People who have been sheltered for most of their lives could be offended by the images they see, as it would be a rude awakening for them. People without access to internet or TV who happen to catch the news and see this would also probably not be used to these images. However, our generation grew up watching the images of both the Iraqi and Afghani wars. Hearing death tolls and seeing images of bombings and shootings and terrorists desensitized many of us towards violence in general, making us all have the same blank reaction to violence no matter what the source. However, this differs between us and our parent generation, who often have a more negative reaction to video game violence. So maybe there is a difference between our generations. Maybe the reaction to violence is not only dependent on the source of information, but the age that views it as well. However, the source of information still has a greater impact than age, as age is too subjective of a standard to hold true in every case. It is difficult to gauge as some people mature faster than others, and there are groups of people who never really mature at all. This is not to discount age as a factor entirely, but rather to show that the source of information is truly the main factor. We can also see this in movies and TV shows as well.
We have looked at how people react when they are the doers of the action versus when they are merely observers of the violence which appears on a credible media source. So let's look at a recent example where people are not necessarily the doers of the action, but still have different reactions to it than when they see violence reported on the news. For example, the movie Taken depicts many violent scenes, including explosions, electrocutions, shootings, and many other events. This movie depicts a dramatic version of a possible real-life situation. However, people still did not have the same reaction to it as they do to the news, since they see it firsthand instead of being passive observers. People had a very strong reaction to this movie, though, with some people being offended and others quite scared and scarred by the images. On the other hand, people aren't necessarily scared by violent news, such as the article we looked at before with the Iraqi and Afghani war, at least within the United States, as we are not actively affected by the violence unless you have a family member deployed in the military over there or did have one. Yet, when people saw the movie Taken, a majority experienced a reaction of hate and disgust towards the kidnappers and the sex trade. They may have even been seriously disturbed and convicted to help. The movie is not a real-life event. Although similar events may occur, this is a dramatized version. Why, then, do people have such a strong reaction to it than versus to a news story that depicts major violence as well that is actually occurring? This again ties back to the source of the information, for the movie resembles a real-life situation designed by the producers to affect your emotional being for profit reasons. The news, on the other hand, is mainly to provide you with accurate information that depicts what is happening in the world. It isn't necessarily displayed to influence your emotional state. Looking at a movie versus a news story, it ties into authority as well. We look at a movie and often forget the expertise of the producers and directors that are working to create it. However, as discussed earlier, we assume that news anchors on respected networks, such as Bill O'Reilly from the O'Reilly Factor, as well as CNN and other reputable news channels, will have a strong education and foundation, making them authoritative figures. Their authority may give them the power to say whatever they want, and the majority of America, seeing as they are uneducated, will take it as facts. Then why does the type of authority affect the reaction that occurs? Well, if you are offended by a movie, then you may believe that the filmmakers are uneducated in what is seen as offensive, or are not at the same level as newscasters that show real violence. Because the violence in the news is coming from these authoritative people, we take it as an event that occurred and often do not take it as something to be offended by. This ties in with our emotion. Filmmakers are paid to manipulate our emotional state. They have experience with creating all types of emotions associated with real-life scenarios of the viewers, depending on the type of music, lighting, and acting. They have the power to make people experience a range of emotions, all within less than 2 hours, whereas a person would normally experience this amount of emotion throughout the span of a 12-hour day. The news can also manipulate emotion, though. For example, huge events like Hurricane Katrina and the typhoon in the Philippines caused people to feel strong sadness and concern for those people shown on the news suffering in the terrible and life-threatening conditions that the violent floodwaters caused. News violence can also be offensive to people. In the news story with Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old gay student beaten to death at Lorraine, both mourners and protesters showed up to attend his funeral. This shows that there may have been different reactions to the act of violence than just sadness. One of the protesters included Richard Osborne, a 74-year-old Okinawa veteran who was holding a sign that stated, "Freedom of choice is the right to hate." He was a soldier in the Okinawa War, and killing people for what he believed was right caused him to be offended that people would look down upon the kids who beat Shepard to death for being gay, which they thought was the right thing to do. This shows how the source of media in this case did not cause the reaction we have seen with other news-related stories, possibly showing an exception to this rule. In addition to the intense emotional reaction inflicted by this news story, there is also the degree of emotion it may inflict on people. People with a strong religious background may feel conflicted by this story because they believe homosexuality is wrong, but also believe that murder is wrong. Others that believe being gay isn't a choice, a lifestyle, might feel a higher degree of sadness and anger. The source of information manipulates both emotion and perception in order to alter the way in which we view violence that is being shown to us. For example, we have looked at video games in comparison to a more recent and accepted news source. Video games are often viewed in a more negative light, since the viewer is also the one causing the violence to occur. Because of this, video games evoke a stronger emotional response than the news. Our generation, especially, is very desensitized to violence as we have seen so much of it on the television due to Afghani and Iraq wars, therefore causing us to view violence both on the news and in video games and movies in a much more ambivalent manner. However, the news in general does not evoke a very strong emotional response, usually because we see the violence merely as an addition to a story that normally does not personally affect us. Therefore, we view news anchors as authority figures that usually give us trusted information due to their background in reporting facts. The violence in this case is viewed as a visual informational tool, a way to enhance a story. On the other hand, both video games and movies tend to evoke more emotional responses as they are intended to manipulate the participant involved in an entertaining way. Therefore, the source of the information does indeed affect the way in which violence is viewed, as it messes with our emotional pathways, which are often based upon our perception of events.